going on here if they have no reason or explanation for why it was done? I mean, look, if she did things and messed with your mind that caused you to snap, you know?
I didn't want to kill her, man. I didn't try to kill her. We just played a role.
It just happened.
It begins the way many true crime stories do, inside an ordinary home, on an ordinary night, with two people who believed they knew each other. There were no warning signs from the outside, no history that suggested what was about to unfold. Just a couple settling into a new place, drinking, talking, trying to build a life together. But somewhere between alcohol, anger, and loss of control, the night crossed a line it could never return from. Hours later, police would arrive to a scene so violent it left seasoned investigators shaken. Neighbors would describe hearing chaos but never imagining the outcome. And one man, sitting alone with the consequences of his actions, would begin telling a story that raised more questions than answers. This is not a case about a momentary mistake. It is a story about escalation, denial, and what happens when rage is left unchecked. This is the case that unfolded before the 911 call was ever made. By all outward appearances, there was nothing remarkable about that evening. The couple had recently moved into a small apartment, still half unpacked, still adjusting to living on their own. Boxes lined the walls. A mattress sat on the floor. There was no couch yet, no dining table, just the essentials and plans to buy the rest later. It was a temporary stage of life, the kind many couples pass through without incident. That day had been normal. Both had worked. Both came home tired but relieved that the weekend had finally arrived. After showering and changing, they decided to go out for dinner and drinks. Nothing elaborate, just a casual restaurant, margaritas, familiar food. They laughed, talked, and posted a photo together before leaving. To anyone watching from the outside, they looked happy. On the way back, they stopped at a liquor store and picked up a bottle of tequila. It felt like a continuation of the night, not the beginning of something dangerous. Back at the apartment, they played music and poured drinks. With no furniture, they sat on the floor, leaning against boxes, sharing stories and teasing each other. The alcohol flowed quickly. The man drank heavily. So did the woman. As the hours passed, the mood shifted. It wasn't one single moment. It was gradual. Subtle changes in tone, irritation creeping into conversation, voices becoming louder. Alcohol loosened filters and sharpened emotions. Small comments turned into jabs. Jabs turned into arguments. At some point, frustration took over. The man became angry, not just verbally but physically. He punched walls. He threw objects across the room. A sliding glass door shattered, glass spraying across the floor. The noise was loud enough to travel through the building, echoing into neighboring apartments. Later, neighbors would recall hearing violent banging for a long time, long enough to make them uneasy, but they never heard the woman screaming for help. Inside the apartment, the destruction was extensive. After the outburst, the argument appeared to die down. According to the man, the tension shifted into something else entirely. They stopped fighting. The anger didn't disappear. It changed form. What followed was intimate, but not in any healthy sense of the word. The woman was heavily intoxicated. Her coordination was poor. Her speech was slurred. Her ability to fully understand what was happening was clearly impaired. Still, the man later claimed that she participated willingly, that she encouraged him. Investigators would later question that claim. The situation escalated rapidly. They moved into a closet. Small, enclosed, barely lit. It was there that the violence intensified. The man admitted to using objects during sexual acts. He described being rough, aggressive, and losing control. At some point, the woman stopped responding. There was blood, a lot of it. Even then, the man did not stop immediately. He later said he believed she was still conscious, still participating. But the physical evidence would tell a different story. Her injuries were catastrophic. The damage was not accidental. It was not survivable. Eventually, the woman was moved into the bathroom. By that time, she was barely alive. The man claimed she said she needed to vomit and asked him to leave. He stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving her alone on the bathroom floor. He said he believed she was still breathing. Minutes passed. When he returned, she was unresponsive. Panic set in. He tried to wake her. He shook her. He splashed water on her face. He attempted CPR, poorly, desperately, without training. Blood covered the bathroom floor. Blood streaked the hallway. Blood stained the closet. Nothing worked. Realizing she was not breathing, he finally called 911. When first responders arrived, the scene was immediately alarming. The apartment showed signs of extreme violence. Broken glass, holes in walls, blood in multiple rooms. The woman lay naked on the bathroom floor. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Officers noted the man's behavior, emotional but inconsistent. Distraught one moment, oddly detached the next. He claimed he didn't remember everything. He insisted he never meant to hurt her. He said he was drunk. He said it was consensual, but his story raised red flags. The extent of the injuries contradicted his claims. The timeline didn't add up. His recollection seemed selective, clear when it suited him, vague when it didn't. As investigators began processing the scene, it became clear this was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not rough sex gone wrong. This was a homicide. The man was taken into custody for questioning. Inside the interrogation room, he continued to describe the night as confusing, emotional, and fueled by alcohol. But as detectives pressed him, small cracks began to appear in his narrative. He admitted he had been angry. He admitted he had destroyed the apartment. He admitted he had lost control. What he had not yet admitted was why. That truth would emerge later, piece by piece, during hours of questioning that would expose a far darker reality behind that seemingly ordinary night. And this was only the beginning. By the time the man sat down in the interrogation room, the adrenaline had worn off. The small windowless space was quiet except for the hum of the lights and the occasional scrape of a chair. Across the table sat detectives who had already seen the apartment, already spoken to neighbors, already reviewed the initial reports from first responders. They were not there to argue. They were there to listen and to test the story they had been given. At first, the man repeated what he had told officers at the scene. He said the night had gotten out of hand. He said both of them were drunk. He said they argued, made up, and then things turned intimate. He emphasized the word consensual, using it often, as if repetition could make it true. He claimed memory gaps, blamed alcohol, and described himself as shocked by the outcome. Detectives let him talk. They asked him to walk through the night again, slowly this time. Where did they go? How much did they drink? What time did they return home? What happened first when they got inside? Each question was calm, methodical, and precise. At one point, he said the argument lasted only a short time. Later, he admitted it went on for much longer. He minimized the damage to the apartment until confronted with photographs showing shattered glass, punched walls, and bloodstains extending across multiple rooms. When detectives asked about the injuries, his answers became vague. He said he didn't realize how badly she was hurt. He said he thought the blood came from a minor injury. He said he believed she was still conscious for most of the encounter. But when pressed to explain specific injuries, how they could have occurred, when they could have occurred, he struggled. The medical examiner's preliminary findings painted a very different picture. The injuries were severe, not superficial, not accidental. They were the result of extreme force applied over time. Some injuries occurred while the victim was alive. Others occurred when she was no longer capable of responding. Detectives did not accuse him outright. Instead, they asked a simple question. At what point did you realize something was wrong? He paused. He said he wasn't sure. That answer mattered. Investigators explained that panic looks a certain way. Fear looks a certain way. People who realize they have hurt someone unintentionally tend to seek help immediately. They call 911 right away. They run for assistance. They do not continue, and they do not leave the person alone. They pointed out that he had stepped outside to smoke. That choice was difficult to explain. The man insisted he believed she was fine. He said she asked him to leave. He said he thought she just needed a moment. But the physical evidence contradicted that explanation. Blood loss alone would have been obvious. Her condition would not have allowed coherent conversation. As the questioning continued, detectives shifted focus. They asked about anger. Had he been angry that night? Yes. Had he felt out of control? Yes. Had he destroyed property before or during arguments? No. Why then did it happen this time? The man struggled to answer. He spoke about stress, about money, about drinking too much, about feeling disrespected, about emotions boiling over. Each explanation felt incomplete, like pieces of a story that did not fully connect. Detectives circled back to the closet. Why the closet? He said it was spontaneous. They asked how a spontaneous decision turned into something that lasted long enough to cause that level of injury. They asked why he didn't stop when things became painful. They asked why there was blood in multiple locations. Again, his answers shifted. He said he didn't notice. He said he thought it was part of the moment. He said he wasn't thinking clearly. But investigators were thinking very clearly. They explained that consent does not exist when someone is incapacitated. The man's demeanor began to change. He became defensive, then emotional, then quiet. At times, he cried. At other moments, he stared at the table, hands clasped, breathing heavily. The confident insistence that everything had been mutual began to weaken. Detectives pressed gently but firmly. They asked him to describe her condition at specific moments. Could she stand? Could she speak clearly? Could she respond to pain? Each question narrowed the space between his version of events and the reality suggested by the evidence. Eventually, the language shifted. He stopped saying we and started saying I. He admitted he had been rough. He admitted he had ignored signs that something was wrong. He admitted he had been angry and taken it out physically, but he still resisted the central truth. He did not want to admit intent. Detectives explained that intent does not always mean planning. Sometimes it means continuing despite knowing harm is occurring. Sometimes it means choosing not to stop. When they asked him why he did not call for help sooner, he had no answer. The silence in the room stretched. This was the moment when the case began to solidify, not because of a confession, but because of collapse. His story could no longer hold its shape. Each attempt to fix one contradiction created another. By the end of the interrogation, detectives knew they were no longer dealing with uncertainty. They were dealing with accountability. Charges would follow. Expert testimony would explain the injuries. Digital records would establish timelines. Witnesses would describe the aftermath. The man would soon understand that alcohol was not a defense, anger was not an excuse, and silence would not erase what had happened. The story he told that night, about confusion, consent, and accident, was already unraveling, and the truth, once exposed, would be far darker than anything he had initially admitted. By the time the interrogation reached its later hours, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. What began as a controlled conversation had turned into something heavier, inevitable. The detectives were no longer trying to understand what happened. They were trying to understand why it happened and whether the man was prepared to face that reality himself. He sat slumped in his chair, eyes red, voice hoarse. The confidence he showed at the beginning of the interview was gone. In its place was exhaustion and fear, the kind that comes when a person realizes there is no version of events left that can save them. Detectives returned to a single point again and again: choice. They explained that the law does not only look at intent formed before an act, it also looks at decisions made during an act. Every moment a person continues despite clear signs of harm is a decision. Every moment they ignore danger is a choice. This time he didn't argue. Instead, he started talking differently. He spoke about feeling overwhelmed, about anger that had been building for weeks, even months. He admitted he had been drinking heavily that night, not just socially, but aggressively. He described feeling disrespected, dismissed, and emotionally rejected earlier in the evening. What he had not processed mentally, he had expressed physically. And then finally, he said the words detectives had been waiting for. He admitted he knew she was no longer responsive. Not immediately, not at first, but at some point before it ended. That admission changed everything. He said he noticed she wasn't reacting the way she had earlier, that her body felt different, that her breathing sounded wrong. But instead of stopping, instead of calling for help, he continued. When detectives asked why, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. He said he was angry. He said he didn't want to stop. He said he wasn't thinking about consequences. In that moment, the narrative of confusion collapsed completely. Detectives asked about the blood. He acknowledged seeing it earlier than he first claimed. He said he thought it would stop. He said he believed she would be okay. But even as he said the words, it was clear he no longer believed them himself. They asked him why he left her alone in the bathroom. He said he needed air. He said he needed to calm down. He said he thought she was still alive. But the medical evidence contradicted that. By the time he stepped outside, her injuries had already reached a point where survival was unlikely. Leaving her alone sealed her fate. When detectives laid that out for him, clearly, without accusation, he broke. He cried openly. He put his head in his hands. He repeated that he didn't mean for this to happen, even as he acknowledged that it did happen because he failed to stop. At this point, the interrogation shifted into documentation. Detectives went through the timeline again, confirming details he had previously denied. He no longer resisted. He corrected himself when he misspoke. He admitted earlier lies about consent, about timing, about how quickly he realized she was in danger. The final version of events was devastating. The violence was not a single act. It was a series of escalating choices, each one making the next more dangerous, each one closing the door to survival. When the interview ended, detectives stepped out of the room knowing the case had crossed a critical threshold. They no longer needed speculation. They had admissions. They had physical evidence. They had medical findings that aligned with his own words. Charges were inevitable. Outside the interrogation room, the apartment was being processed again, this time with greater clarity. Blood pattern analysis confirmed movement between rooms. The destruction of property supported the timeline of rage. The absence of any attempt to seek immediate medical help reinforced the conclusion investigators had reached. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a homicide born out of unchecked anger and control. In the days that followed, prosecutors reviewed the case carefully. They weighed the admissions against the evidence. They considered how a jury would see the narrative, not emotionally, but legally. The charges reflected the severity of the crime. Meanwhile, the victim's family began the process no one is ever prepared for. They learned details they could never unhear. They faced a reality that did not match the person they remembered leaving home that night. They were forced to reconcile love with loss, memory with brutality. For them, there were no legal arguments, only grief. The man, now officially charged, was transferred into custody. The panic attacks, the confusion, the claims of memory loss faded into the background. What remained was a record, a detailed account of choices that could not be undone. This case would eventually move toward court. There would be hearings, expert witnesses, legal motions, a sentencing phase that would attempt to assign years to a life lost. But no matter what the final outcome, one truth was already fixed. The night did not go wrong. It was pushed there, step by step, until there was no way back. And in that reality, there would be no redemption, only consequences. By the time the case reached court, the story was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what could be proven, what had been admitted, and what the law required in response. The courtroom was quiet in the way that serious rooms often are, measured, restrained, heavy with expectation. Prosecutors did not need theatrics. They presented a clear sequence of events supported by physical evidence, medical findings, and the defendant's own words. The defense, meanwhile, focused on mitigation, alcohol, emotional instability, lack of prior violent history, hoping to soften the outcome rather than rewrite the truth. There was no jury trial. Faced with the evidence, the defendant entered a guilty plea. In doing so, he acknowledged responsibility for the death, not in the emotional language of regret, but in the legal language that matters most. The plea ended any debate over intent and shifted the case into its final phase, sentencing. At sentencing, the court heard from experts. Medical professionals explained the injuries in clinical terms, careful, precise, unflinching. They described the progression of trauma, the point at which survival became impossible, and the length of time during which intervention could have changed the outcome. The body's responses, blood loss, loss of consciousness, respiratory failure, are unmistakable. Ignoring them is not confusion, it is neglect. The court also heard from the victim's family. They did not speak in anger, they spoke in grief. They talked about the person she was before that night, the plans she had, the relationships she valued, the future she expected to have. They spoke about unanswered messages, empty rooms, and the unbearable finality of knowing she never came home. They spoke about loss that could not be measured in years or sentences. For them, there was no closure, only an ending. The defendant spoke as well. He expressed remorse. He said he wished he could go back. He said he never intended to kill her. He said he would carry the weight of his actions for the rest of his life. The court listened, and then the judge spoke. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the choices that led to it. The judge emphasized that violence fueled by anger and alcohol is not spontaneous, it is preventable. That stopping, calling for help, and seeking medical attention were all options that night, options that were ignored. The sentence was lengthy, long enough to remove the defendant from society for decades, long enough to ensure that he would not simply move on from what he had done, long enough to send a clear message about accountability. When the gavel came down, the case was officially closed, but the impact was not. Cases like this leave behind more than records and transcripts. They leave behind questions, hard ones, uncomfortable ones. How quickly anger escalates when unchecked. How alcohol magnifies impulses rather than creating them. How easily people mistake control for consent. How silence in critical moments becomes fatal. This case also challenged a common narrative, that extreme violence is always sudden or unforeseeable. Here, it was not. It was a series of decisions layered on top of each other, each one narrowing the possibility of safety until none remained. The law does not judge thoughts, it judges actions, and the actions in this case spoke clearly. For the family left behind, life did not pause for the trial. They returned to work. They attended holidays with one person missing. They learned to navigate conversations where her name could not be spoken without breaking down. Justice for them was not satisfaction, it was recognition. Recognition that what happened mattered. Recognition that it was wrong. Recognition that it would not be minimized or excused. For the broader public, the case served as a reminder of something uncomfortable but essential. Violence does not always announce itself. It can begin in ordinary spaces, between people who know each other, fueled by emotions that feel familiar until they spiral beyond control. And once that line is crossed, there is no version of events that makes it less real. The apartment has long since been cleaned. New tenants may live there now, unaware of what once occurred behind those walls. The headlines have faded. The case has been archived. But consequences do not fade the same way. They remain in prison cells, in empty chairs at family gatherings, in memories that surface without warning. They remain as lessons, costly ones, about responsibility, restraint, and the irreversible nature of violence. When the courtroom emptied that day, the legal process had done its job. The truth had been established. Accountability had been assigned. What remains is the simplest and hardest truth of all. One life ended far too soon. Another was forever defined by the moment he chose not to stop. And nothing, no apology, no sentence, no explanation, can change that.